Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. Those that turn on your camera, those that didn't, you can turn on your camera. I'm talking from Israel. It's 10 p.m. We're in lockdown, but we can still come to work. I was just in isolation for a week because my daughter was exposed to someone at our daycare and she tested negative, but we still, so all this chaotic corona stuff. But here we are to talk about science problems that can be solved, at least in principle. And I'm very happy to actually be able to dive with you into the piece of science that I love. And it's fell in love with physiology and medicine in the past few years. And I'm going to share my screen and share my science with you. And if you could figure out a way so you can both see me and the slides, that would be the best. And if you need to put me somewhere, put me in the lower left corner of the slide. That's where I like to be. And maybe you can see the guitar behind me. So I'm going to do some songs too during this talk. So I want someone to unmute and tell me if you could see my slides, and also you can see me at the same time. Can somebody unmute and say?
Yes.
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 Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Great. And I'm going to ask you to use chat to do questions. So my goal is to have 100 questions at the end of this, and maybe I'll also be able to answer. So wanted to share with you some thoughts about design principles of hormone circuits, and I'm going to focus on the hydrogen atom of the hormone circuits, the glucose and insulin system, probably the best understood hormone circuit, and my slide doesn't advance. And it has to do with some dreadful diseases like type 2 diabetes, which is very, very big pandemic. Actually, 10% of the world population. Too high blood glucose damages blood vessels, and you get heart attacks and stroke, amputations, end-stage kidney diseases, and nerves. And 4,000 people every day are diagnosed with diabetes in America. And 1 out of every 7 healthcare dollars is about treating diabetes. And then there's another, oh, by the way, the origins of this disease are very complex and mysterious. They have to do something with insulin resistance. And it's also curable. I mean, if you eat and exercise right, you can control it usually. But this type 1 diabetes is not curable. Once you have it, usually as a child, you have to take insulin for life. The immune system, here's another mystery. Why does our immune system kill our own beta cells that make insulin? That's what happened in type 1 diabetes. It's not clear why this happens, and it's not clear for any autoimmune disease. So type 2 diabetes is very mysterious, and type 1 diabetes and autoimmune disease is very mysterious. And we're going to understand thoughts about both of these diseases in this talk. The kind of principles of why are these diseases and where do they originate? And why are they so common? You know, and the way we'll do that is by looking at some universalities in these diseases and understanding that you can treat certain aspects of them with simple circuits. And this is going to be the PhD projects of Omer Karin, who just finished his PhD. And he found principles for organ size control, compensation of parameters, and mutant resistance that you'll all see in this talk, using the insulin system as a glucose system as a model system. Okay, that's our plan. By the end of this talk, you'll understand type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, organ size control, how circuits compensate for variability in parameters and resist mutants. So that's a big task, and I hope we can do it together. And let's start. So glucose in the blood, if you measure it, you see that in most people, it's very similar number, 5 millimolar concentration, and within 10% of 5 millimolar, unless you have diabetes, which is defined by too high blood glucose. And there's certain, it's a blood test that tells you if you have diabetes. And if you eat a meal or if you drink 70 grams of glucose, that's the glucose oral tolerance test, you get this very stereotyped response. It's not only the baseline, it's also the response to drinking glucose. It's very stereotyped. And if you have too high glucose, or after 2 hours, too high glucose, you have type 2 diabetes, you're diagnosed. And the way this works is by a hormone called insulin. So glucose is in the blood, and it can't go into cells like muscle cells and fat cells because the transporters are hidden inside the cell. But insulin binds to insulin receptors and make those transporters go to the membrane, and then those muscle and fat cells can take up glucose. And that's why insulin, the hormone insulin, removes glucose from the blood. Yeah? And it's produced, this hormone, in special cells called beta cells. Will be important for our talk, that lie in our pancreas, which is a dollar-sized organ over here. And it has these islets and about 1 billion beta cells, million islets with each one with about 1,000 beta cells that produce insulin. And the feedback circuit is that the beta cells produce insulin when glucose is high. So when glucose is high, the beta cells produce insulin, and insulin reduces blood glucose by making it go into the cells. So it's a negative feedback that acts on the time scale of minutes to hours. And I'm going to pause now until one of you asks me a question on the chat. So please open up the chat and ask me a question, because I will not continue unless there's a question on the chat. I hope I made my offer clear. So who will be the first person to ask me a question? Even if everything here is clear, you can say everything is clear, but maybe there's a question arising in your mind. This is a good time to ask me. You can also open up your mic and ask me by speech. Okay, so first question, what got me interested in diabetes? Good question. After administration of glucose, there is a spike. Does it recover to equal or levels in type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes? So got me interested in diabetes is a poster showing that glucose makes beta cells divide and die, which was paradoxical. Since I was working on paradoxical circuits in bacteria, that was got me interested. That was 10 years ago. What about leptin? So there's experts here, leptin, which has to do with obesity. I'm not going to discuss leptin or glucagon or many, many other hormones, because I'm going to make simplifications on what I think is essential to understand the disease. But of course, leptin and other hormones, glucagon, are very important too. Does type 1 diabetes have the same blood glucose response? So type 1 diabetes, you don't have beta cells, so you don't have insulin. So when you take the glucose oral tolerance test, the glucose goes very high. And the way you diagnose type 1 diabetes is that you have no insulin. Type 2 diabetes, you have a little bit of insulin. In advanced type 2 diabetes, you need to take insulin. So thanks for the questions, and I'm going to continue now.
I have a question about insulin production in type 2 diabetes.
Insulin production, type 2 diabetes, the beta cells, they make insulin, but there's insulin resistance, and so the insulin isn't very effective. And at late stages...
Yes, so yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand, because a lot of recent metabolic research seems to suggest that the reason the insulin resistance comes into play is because your fat cells don't have any storage left. So like the receptors, the fat cells are saying, hey, too much insulin. So coming in, we can't take more. So the pancreas kind of racks up the insulin production. So I think it's like two systems fighting off each other, right?
Yeah, I mean, the comment is about what causes type 2 diabetes, and it begins with insulin resistance, which means that insulin doesn't work as well, and that can have to do with fat causing all kind of effects like inflammation-like effects. But I'll talk about that. Can cells get overwhelmed with glucose or damaged if they absorb too much glucose? I don't know. All right. So
I think you also start urinating the glucose, right? Because once you have too much blood glucose, if you take the hormonal injection, it will force the fat in. But if you don't do that, you just start urinating everything.
Yeah. So
there's a feedback mechanism.
Astana speaking.
Yes, that's me.
So Kanish, I'm going to ask you to let me continue, because I'll get to your questions, and to type your comments on the chat, so that we can complete this talk. But indeed, one of the symptoms of diabetes is that insulin resistance, a lot of blood glucose, and then there's different effects that cause you to be very hungry, to urinate, to be very thirsty, and this is a lot of times some of the symptoms that get you diagnosed. All right, but still I'm talking about the healthy person. This is how the feedback works, and this circuit explains you drink the glucose goes up, insulin goes up, glucose is removed. And that's a classic model that's used also to analyze biological data. And it's fine. But there's parameters in this circuit like insulin resistance. So different conditions can cause insulin to work less well. And this parameter S becomes small, the effect of a unit of insulin on removing glucose. So for example, obesity, like we discussed, inflammation, infection, pregnancy can make you insulin resistant. And it's basically a mechanism to help divert glucose, let's say, to the fetus or to the brain or to the immune system. It's a useful parameter to help the body control where glucose is going. Is it to the fat and muscle, or is it to the brain and the immune system, etc.? So here's a parameter that changes, let's say, by a factor of 10 between people. Let's say insulin resistance means insulin is less effective. And when you use this feedback loop, you see that if insulin is 10 times less effective, glucose should rise and everything should look like diabetes. But here's the first paradox. Most people with obesity that have 10 times smaller insulin sensitivity, they're very insulin resistant, in reality actually have very normal glucose levels. So 80% of people with obesity don't have diabetes, they have normal glucose. So what is going on here? And that's a finding that led researchers to understand that there's additional feedback loop, a compensation that works over weeks. And that compensation is that people with obesity or in the late stage of pregnancy, etc., increase their beta cell amount. So they have more beta cells, both divide more and grow more, and therefore they secrete more insulin, and somehow this exactly compensates the insulin resistance, the reduction in the effectiveness of each insulin molecule. So this is what we're going to discuss, this very important feedback loop. And the way it works is that glucose itself controls the beta cell growth. So that's another feedback loop where high glucose makes more beta cells, more insulin, and therefore less glucose. And this feedback loop is not usually, it's very well known physiologically, but it's not considered usually medically or theoretically. And I think it's really very crucial. And in fact, it's a kind of a circuit motif, as we'll see, that has very important properties. Early one morning, the sun was shining. I was sleeping in, wondering if my beta cells were still secreting insulin. What with the rise of type 1 diabetes and type 2 as well, all over our planet, you never can tell. I was standing on the side of the road, rain falling down on my shoes, heading out to the clinic. God knows I paid my dues getting through. Tangled up in glucose. You know, she was married when we first met. She was soon to be divorced. Helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. We both had type 1 diabetes with an insulin syringe. We split up on a dark, sad night after an eating binge. I felt my glucose drop. My world began to fade away. She said over my shoulder, we'll meet again someday on the avenue. Tangled up in glucose. Drifted up to the, that's of course the song by the great Bob Dylan, Tangled Up in Glucose. When's the album coming out? That's a nice question. So compensation is achieved by glucose making beta cells grow. And try to advance my slides. And here we enter the worlds of cell growing and dividing. And I want to make a point here that I used to work on a lot on bacteria protein circuits inside cells, and they're almost always stable. They're really, really very safe circuits inside cells. And the circuits of cells dividing are completely unlike that. So if you have a typical protein, it's produced and it's removed, and it has a steady state, which is the ratio of production and removal. And no matter where you start, you go to a steady state. Sometimes it's bistable. But cells are autocatalytic because all cells come from cells. So the more cells you have, the more they divide and the more they're removed. So the equations are proliferation minus removal times cells. And that is an exponential equation. So if you have proliferation more than removal, you have exponential growth, like cancer. And if you have removal more than proliferation, you have cell death, like degenerative disease. So just to keep organs at the right size is not easy, and you need some kind of feedback. So this problem of organ size control, that's our first kind of very important problem we have. Even beta cells, how does the body keep the right amount of beta cells without exploding or dying? And that is what this circuit does. This circuit that I just showed you not only controls glucose at 5 millimolar and adjusts for any change in insulin resistance, it also keeps the number of beta cells appropriate. So that it's a very, very powerful circuit. And the way it works is the blood glucose controls beta cell growth and death. In fact, it dramatically controls beta cell death. This is the physiological range. So I'm going to plot it like this. Beta cell removal range is a function of glucose. So you see at 5 millimolar, it drops very sharply. And then at high glucose, glucose kills the cells that control it. That's called glucotoxicity. And that's what got me into diabetes, that question. This paradoxical effect. We'll consider glucotoxicity soon. Now let's just focus on this part, near 5 millimolars, where glucose controls the death rate of the cells. So if glucose controls the death rate, I can also plot the proliferation rate of beta cells as a function of glucose. And where removal equals proliferation, at that glucose concentration, we have our steady state. That is the feedback where the cells removal equals proliferation. So check out how this works. If I have too much glucose for a while, let's say I have insulin resistance, I have too much glucose, proliferation is higher than removal. So beta cells grow, mass expands, more insulin, and therefore less glucose. Less glucose, you move back. And when does it stop? At 5 millimolar. If I have too little glucose for a while, beta cells are removed more than proliferate. Beta cell mass shrinks, less insulin, more glucose, then I go back. So this locks glucose at 5 millimolar and adjusts the cell beta cell mass at exactly the right needed amount and keeps it there as beta cells are turning over with a turnover time of maybe days in rodents and weeks in human beings. So I hope if there's any question about this, these graphs, I'm going to show you quite a lot. It's rate plots for removal and proliferation. And when they cross, it's a fixed point. And where you move away, you can see if proliferation is more than removal, beta cells grow and they reduce insulin and you get this stability. That's why we know this is a stable fixed point. What about the effect of visceral fat? I found that visceral fat clogs up the liver and pancreas, not necessarily glucose directly mediating the circuit. But visceral fat causes a lot of problems. It causes signals for inflammation. It makes fatty acid build up in the muscle, which causes insulin resistance. And so, but the main controller of so many things control beta cell mass, but the main controller is known to be glucose. And there's other things too, leptin, growth hormone, fatty acid, etc. But glucose is the main one. And again, I'm ignoring all those other factors just so we see the principle. I hope I answered your question. Okay, so that's organ size control. And notice how steep this removal drop is. So if you, for instance, you grow older and proliferation weakens, the fixed point only moves a little bit from 5 millimolar to 5.2 or something, right? So this sharp drop is important to make this fixed point, this glucose robust. And I want to just say in passing that there's a beautiful mathematical property that Omer Klein proved, that when you're at the steady state here, no matter what your insulin resistance is, the entire dynamic curve is completely the same no matter what your insulin resistance. So if your insulin resistance drops here, as you become insulin resistant, this is insulin sensitivity, become insulin resistant, glucose rises, but then beta cells rise to compensate. Glucose goes back to normal, insulin goes up, and your pulse of glucose after you drink some glucose is abnormal in the transient, but then goes back to normal because of a beautiful symmetry in the equations, and you can check it out in this paper in molecular systems biology. So this circuit not only keeps organ size control, but also compensates for insulin resistance and for many other parameters of the circuit. And you can see that people with obesity and people without obesity, they eat some meals, and they basically have the same dynamics, even though the insulin resistance is very different and the amount of insulin is very different. And you can understand that with this kind of model. This feedback loop was originally discovered by Brian Top in around 2000. And I think it's very fundamental. And I just want to say, it's not only in the beta cells, many other hormone circuits like the thyroid, the adrenal, have the same circuit where the signal makes the hormone secreted, but also makes the cells grow. So we think in all these systems, the same circuit motif keeps organ size control and make things impervious to fluctuations in parameters. And so if it's so perfect and so great, why do we have type 2 diabetes? How does the circuit break down? If it's such a great circuit, here the answer is, well, there's two answers. One answer is that when beta cells mass needs to grow in order to compensate for insulin resistance, to grow, to make more insulin, there's always a limit. It can't grow without limit. And then you hit what's called prediabetes. Glucose starts going up because beta cells can't compensate anymore. But the severe type 2 diabetes comes from glucotoxicities. This is the paradoxical arm I told you about before, where glucose makes beta cells die, and glucose reduces beta cell death, but then makes it rise again. So at high levels, let's say 15 millimolar and above, glucose kills beta cells by reactive oxygen species and all kinds of mechanisms. If insulin is 1,000 times less effective, you need 1,000 times beta cells. Exactly. So there's a question here. If insulin is 1,000 times less effective, you need 1,000 times as much beta cells, but you can't do that. So there's a limit. And therefore, enough insulin resistance will eventually saturate the compensation, and then you get prediabetes, which is extremely common. I think probably 30% of Americans have prediabetes, or something like 25, something like that. And then that can go into diabetes, full-blown diabetes, which, as I said, is 10%. So thanks for that question. And so how does glucotoxicity cause type 2 diabetes? So we have removal and proliferation. And you see, glucotoxicity means removal goes up. And check this out. It crosses proliferation another time. There's a second fixed point. So while glucose is here, proliferation is high, beta cells mass grows, and you go back to 5 millimolar. But if you cross this unstable fixed point, the lines cross. If it's very high glucose, beta cells die more than they're made. So beta cells die, there's less insulin and more glucose. And that is a vicious cycle. So if you get into this gray zone of too high glucose, glucotoxicity kills the beta cells. There's less beta cells, less insulin, more glucose, less beta cells, more glucose. And that vicious cycle looks a lot like late stage type 2 diabetes, where you lose beta cells and eventually you need insulin injections. So there's a question, is insulin secretion linear with the number of beta cells? So as far as I know, insulin secretion is linear in the number of beta cells, but it's non-linear in glucose. It goes like glucose to the third for a while or something like that. So there's a parameter, glucose secretion per beta cell, and the compensation I talked about is also compensates for that parameter. So if the beta cells are tired, they can still grow, they can grow in mass to compensate for their secretion per cell. So that's over weeks. All right, so this additional fixed point is terrible. It makes, if glucose fluctuate like this, but if you go up here, you can get into a vicious cycle. This, by the way, explains why type 2 diabetes is a curable disease. Suppose you have very high glucose levels in the vicious cycle regime, and now you start dieting and exercising and running and skating and Tai Chi, and you go back to the basin of attraction of the stable fixed point. You go back here, and proliferation more than removal, beta cells grow and thrive, and you go back to 5 millimolar. So if you can only change your lifestyle, you can go back, unless beta cells are completely destroyed. So this bistability explains why type 2 diabetes is curable, but most people can't do that for some reason. So what about fructotoxicity? Most people eating sugar, yeah. So there's there are additional components. So fructose and fatty acids, etc. They all modulate. So there's glucolipotoxicity. But again, I want to keep things simple. And indeed, a bad diet can disrupt, let's say, it can make glucotoxicity. Let me show you what it can do. It can do this. A bad diet can make glucotoxicity worse, and therefore move the dangerous fixed point, the unstable fixed point, closer to 5 millimolar. So you don't need as much glucose in your diet to cross it. I hope I explained myself. So this is the kind of things where genetic background can make nutrition, fats, that, and we need to know more about glucotoxicity in order to understand how genetics and environment affect the chance for, so fructose would play a role here, etc. And also age. Look what happens with age. With age, proliferation rate drops of cells in our body. In all our cell proliferation rates drop. And when proliferation rate drops, the intersection point moves closer to 5 millimolar. And it's very dangerous. So now you don't need as much glucose to cross over. And that's one reason that age is the major risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Probability of type 2 diabetes, the incidence of type 2 diabetes goes exponentially with age. And that's one of the reasons. There's additional reasons like increased inflammation, etc. So there's a question, can you revert diabetes by increasing proliferation of beta cells? That is a gold standard question, and people are trying to do that, but it's very difficult so far to make beta cells thrive once they're in a bad situation. But that's a major research goal, so thanks. And I see that you guys are following me according to the question. I'm grateful, and I'm feeling that I'm connected to you at this moment. So please keep asking me on the chat, and any kind of question is welcome. All right, so we have this glucotoxicity, and that's a fact. The question is now, why do we have this glucotoxicity? Why is this curse laid upon us? If we didn't have glucotoxicity, we wouldn't have this unstable fixed point. Maybe we wouldn't have type 2 diabetes. Why do we need it? So people in biology often ask how? How does it happen? So it happens because beta cells are exquisitely sensitive to reactive oxidative species, and the glycolysis, there's many how answers, but why? Why? Is it just an accident? So Omer not only discovered the compensation, he also asked, what if we imagine that glucotoxicity has a physiological role, an important role? What does that tell us? Okay, so that's an interesting way of thinking. And he found an answer. And that answer is that once you have our wonderful circuit, where the signal makes the cells secrete a hormone, but also proliferate, our wonderful circuit for cell size control, you automatically become fragile to a certain kind of mutant. That is a mutant that thinks there's too much glucose. And those mutants actually happen. For example, an enzyme called glucokinase, the first step of glucose in the cells to be phosphorylated, so it can't go out. So if you have a mutant glucokinase in a cell that has a higher affinity to glucose, you think there's more glucose out there, and the cell behaves like there's too much glucose. If there's a lot of glucose, what does the cell do? It says, oh, we need more insulin. So it starts to proliferate and secrete. Once you have a clone of cells that secrete a lot of insulin, you push glucose down, and if those cells take over, they push down to what these cells think is 5 millimolar, but maybe it's actually only 2 millimolar, and you die. That's hypoglycemia. So these mutants can be lethal. And in fact, some babies are born with those mutations, and they have lethal hypoglycemia. You have to cut off the pancreas in order to save them. So that's, or thyroid toxic nodule, in thyroid nodules in the thyroid. This idea applies to all endocrine systems, basically, with the same circuit. So Omer recognized that there's a dangerous mutant. And then he said, look at this mutant. This mutant that thinks it's 5 millimolar is actually 25, proliferates more than it dies, and would grow. But glucotoxicity, so that's lethal. But glucotoxicity is very neat, because if a cell thinks they're 25 millimolar glucose, it kills itself. So glucotoxicity is proposed to be a mutant-resistant mechanism to resist mutants that thinks there's way too much glucose. Instead of them proliferating and taking over the pancreas and making too much insulin and killing you, they're programmed to say, too much glucose, we die. That is called a biphasic response, a signal that kills you at low and at high levels. And that's in this paper, Molecular Systems Biology 2017. You can read about it because, by the way, a collaborator, Yuval Do, tested this by taking a mouse and putting glucokinase mutants that have higher affinity to glucose, so these hypersensing mutants. And when you put them out in low numbers with GFP inside a mouse, a few of the cells are like that, glucose goes down, and then those cells are just removed. So they actually do die. If all the beta cells are mutant, there's this hypoglycemia. But if there's a few of them, if all of them are there, they push the glucose down to the level they think is 5 millimolar, and they're fine. But if there are only a few of them, they can't push down glucose. They think glucose is too high, and they kill themselves. So, in fact, it looks like this is actually happening inside the mouse. And a similar biphasic strategy is found in other systems. Neurons. Neurons die if they're not active enough, and also if they're too active. That's called activity toxicity. Immune cells die if they're not stimulated enough, and also overstimulated. That's called antigen toxicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we think this biphasic strategy could be, which is mysterious and linked to different diseases, could be a mutant resistance strategy, similar to MYC. MYC in cancer, if MYC is overexpressed, it kills the cell, so you have to have mild expression, etc. Any questions about this idea that biphasic? So basically, glucotoxicity, it's a trade-off. It protects you from mutants, but it also gives you type 2 diabetes. So its position of this fixed point shouldn't be too close, otherwise you get too much type 2 diabetes, or too far, otherwise you don't kill mutants, right? So there's a trade-off between mutant resistance and disease that is proposed here. I hope that somebody chats, and I want to see if you're with me. You can also say cool or I don't agree. Death by hyperactivity, Ben says, would increase the stimulant per cell. Wouldn't this be anti-protective? So death by hyperactivity, just imagine that there's very few mutant cells, so they can't really affect glucose yet until they take over. So you kill them when there's just a few, right? You kill the dangerous cells before they can take over. Once they take over, you're right, they skew glucose, and that's lethal. But when they're just a few, they don't really affect glucose. I hope I answered your question and I understood your question. Ben, could you type yes or no if I understood your question? Okay. What's the range on binding affinity on mutants? What is the frequency of generation? Yes, that makes sense. Frequency of generation of the hyperactive. Okay, the hyperactive mutants, you're supposed to be born with hundreds of them according to mutation rate. And what's the range of binding affinity on the mutants? So mutants we know about can be way oversensing or mildly oversensing. That's the next point I want to make. Our biphasic mechanism here works for mutants that think glucose is beyond this fixed point. But what about these mild mutants? Mutants where it's actually 5 millimolar, but they think it's 6 or 7 or 8. Mild missensing mutants. You see, they proliferate more than they die. And they're still dangerous. So we need another mechanism to get rid of these mild mutants. That was the next step in our journey of adventure that started from wondering about glucotoxicity, et cetera. And this led us to a theory of why there are autoimmune diseases, and not all autoimmune diseases. Some autoimmune diseases like lupus and they're caused by antibodies we don't understand. But all these endocrine immune diseases like type 1 diabetes that affect endocrine cells, or thyroiditis that affect the thyroid, or Addison's that affect the adrenal. All these classic autoimmune diseases where T cells kill your own endocrine cells, we have now a theory, and it has to do with this mutant resistance. And this theory was done by Yael Cohen, who was a PhD student from physics background, and Neil Friedman, who's a physicist, systems immunologist at Weizmann. He runs a lab and he's doing experiments to test this. Now, this was published recently in the journal Immunity, a theory of why there's autoimmune disease. Yeah? So in type 1 diabetes, T cells, which have these T cell receptors, they can recognize usually viruses, bacteria, etc. Some T cells recognize beta cells and kill them. Why? Why do you have that? Why should we have that? So the mainstream thought is that these T cells are an error of the tolerance mechanisms that should remove self-reactive T cells. And that's, and some genetic backgrounds make you more likely to have these errors, etc. But again, we said, what if we think that these T cells that kill beta cells have a physiological function? Again, so the same idea is asking, what if the disease is a side effect of a more important physiological function? The function is so important that it makes 99% of the people survive, and at the expense of 1% of the kids getting type 1 diabetes. Okay, so what is so important to have T cells that kill our own beta cells? So the idea is that these T cells would kill these dangerous mutants in the hatched region here between the fixed points. That's the idea. We need to kill those mutants. So I'll take you through it. Again, mutants that missense the signal can proliferate and do proliferate, actually, like they do proliferate in many diseases. So the idea is that you have T cells that are very special. These T cells are against self, but they go into the pancreas and they look for beta cells that are different from their neighbors, and they kill them. And how do they know which beta cells to kill? They're looking, so how can they tell? They're looking for beta cells that secrete more insulin than their neighbors. Okay? So that's the idea. We call it autoimmune surveillance of hypersecreting mutants, Hashem. And in order for it to work, you need that the autoantigen, that's to say what the T cell recognizes, is in the pathway making the secreted molecule insulin. So the T cells can know which beta cell to kill, and that T cells can differentially tell a beta cell from its neighbor if it's making more of this antigen. So the T cells need to have differential ability to kill. And then you get that if it's just right, you kill the mutants. If you don't have this mechanism, you get this clonal expansion and you get a hypersecreting disease. And for some reason, in some people, these special agents turn into too much and then call in antibody producing cells, and then you get autoimmune disease. And we don't understand why this transition. We're just saying that these T cells are there in everyone for a physiological reason, and they're the ones that are give you the fragility to go into autoimmune disease. And by the way, the same circuit, as I said, is found in thyroid. It has Hashimoto, where T cells attack the thyroid cells. About 5% of people in this listening to this talk have Hashimoto, especially women. It's very, very common. You have to take thyroid hormone supplements. Type 1 diabetes, Addison's disease of cortisol, vitiligo, pernicious anemia. A lot of diseases have the same circuit. So what I'm talking about here is a circuit for signal for homeostasis and organ size control has this fragility to mutants, and you need, in our theory, T cells to take care of it, and they explain all these diseases. And so the first prediction is that the autoantigens should be in the secretion pathway, so T cells can recognize the cell that makes more. And in, for instance, thyroid, there's this TG and TPO antigens. They're just the end proteins that make up the thyroid hormone. And anyway, this prediction is true for all autoimmune diseases. In type 1 diabetes, the antigens are insulin, pre-proinsulin, enzymes involved in insulin production. And that's explains why in autoimmune disease, it's those antigens that are usually found. And also T cells have the ability to tell one cell from another based on minute differences in how much antigen they express on their surface, especially if it's a mid-range binding. So T cells can do it. And this also explains findings where all of us, healthy people, have autoreactive T cells. So all of us have T cells that kill beta cells, not only people who have autoimmune disease. So all these facts together are explained. And my favorite prediction is that if you look at glands, some glands like thyroid, beta cells, etc., have a lot of autoimmune disease. But then there are also glands, like parathyroid glands sitting on top of the thyroid, that very rarely have autoimmune disease, almost never, or alpha cells or kidneys. So our theory says, okay, they don't have these T cell attacks, so they should be prone to mutant expansion disease. That's a prediction. And indeed they are. Parathyroid mutant expansion causes hyperparathyroidism in 2% of women. Renin secretion cells. So each one of these cells have their. So if you have autoimmune disease, again, it's a trade-off. Either you have autoimmune disease or you have these mutant expansion diseases in old age. And usually it makes hormone problems, but they don't kill you. So if the hormone problems kill you, you need to have the autoimmunity, and if not, you have. So it's a balance between hypersecretion I know I'm going very fast. So, but we're at the end, so we have a lot of time for questions. Oh, before we finish. Stop sharing for a sec. I want to see you guys. I am just a T cell, but my story's seldom told. Educated in the thymus, I learned how to defend my country, laying low, seeking out those lymph nodes where the other T cells go, seeking out the places only they will know. 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99. When I first came to the pancreas, I saw a lot of beta cells secreting insulin. Then I saw a hyper-secreting mutant, making so much pre-pro-insulin, you know, I knew what I had to do. Pulled out my dagger, did what a T-cell has to do. 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99. Oh, I hope those hyper-secreting mutants don't expand to form a clone, make too much insulin. Make me call in the B-cell army. Start a civil war with brother cell, killing brother cell. This we must avoid, after all, I am a pacifist. 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99, 99. Thanks, Eric, for the candle. All right, so that's the song about celebrating the T cell. Of course, having a song about a theory doesn't make it correct. So we're doing experiments of different kinds to test this. And I can tell you about that if you ask. Classic Simon and Garfunkel. I got a thumbs up. Thanks for great songwriting. The adrenal glands and thyroid also have clinically frequent hypersecretion disorder. Does this fit in with the model? So it's true. Some organs not only have the autoimmune disease, they have the opposite, the clonal expansion. So those organs are usually the large organs, like thyroid and adrenal. And I think my theory is they crank up autoimmune, the immune cell resistance to the maximum they can without having too much autoimmunity. And then they're still prone to this toxic nodules. So they have to do both. They're somehow balancing both. Does that make sense? Amit Legenda, if that makes sense, please write, or if that doesn't make sense, right? Do beta cells that sense more glucose secrete more insulin or other proteins that T cells can recognize? Yeah, so beta cells that sense more glucose, they secrete more insulin, but the T cells can't recognize the insulin. What they can recognize is that the beta cells, like all cells, break up their own proteins and present them on these MHC complexes so that T cells can know if they're infected by viruses or if they're cancerous, etc. So what the T cells can take is proteins that are in the pathway, like pre-pro-insulin that makes insulin, or enzymes that make insulin, etc. And that's what is attacked in autoimmune disease. So that's how the T cells. Amit says, I think so. What factors do you think lead to choosing possible autoimmunity versus possible mutant expansion? I believe that the main factor is organ size. If the organ is very large, above 1 gram, like beta cells, thyroid gland, adrenal glands, then you have so many mutants, you have to have these T cells. If it's tiny, like parathyroid gland, 1/10 of a gram, the pituitary, 1/10 of a gram, etc., then you can live with the numbers. And if you have mutants, they'll only show up at old age where there's less selective pressure. So I think it's organ size, and then also the lethality. Which is more lethal, having too much hormone or too little hormone? So in the paper, we have a little computation about that. And that, I think, sets the balance. Ethan, Matt, do the more glucose-sensitive beta cell clones are favored to proliferate in the first place because they consume more glucose and therefore have higher metabolism? I don't know. Good question. But wouldn't these same proteins be shown on all beta cells? Yes. So all beta cells show the protein. And it's very important to know about the immune system that it can get used to a background level. The way it does that is with these regulatory T cells that inhibit the killer T cells. And they are proportional to the amount of background. So there's like a background subtraction. And then if one cell is above the background, then the T cells get alarmed. So it's all like a change. It's basically a fold change detector, as we know in systems biology, where the regulatory T cells normalize out the signal. And that's very important. And without this idea can't work. And so this, Dan, I hope that made sense, or did I answer your question? You can say yes or no. Great questions. What factors do you think lead to possible autoimmunity versus possible mutant expansion? I said that. I think I answered that on the organ. From Dan to everyone, like this. So maybe you can sharpen the question. So we're ready to summarize and get more questions. We have 10 minutes for a question period. And so we made a journey through diseases and hormones and circuits to glean some potential general principles. So the first principle has to do with the fact cells are unstable. They either grow exponentially or crash. And so organ size control requires feedback. And therefore, the signal makes the cells grow. And then it also causes a hormone to control the signal. And this gives you great organ size control and compensation. But, there's always a but, you become sensitive to a certain kind of mutant, which is if you oversense the signal, you proliferate, hypersecrete, and that's dangerous. So it's not like electronics where you can put in an integral feedback device and make it very precise. This is biology, so the feedback itself can get mutated, yeah? And then you have this, okay, so, but the next step in our puzzle, so you need to remove the mutants. So you do this biphasic killing, glucotoxicity, right? And then you kill the mutants. But this poses a risk for type 2 diabetes, because if glucose, it's not the mutant thinking there's too much glucose. If glucose is really too high, you get type 2 diabetes. So that's, again, there's a trade-off. And then you have these mild mutants, and then to get rid of them, we propose the T cells. And that works in most of us, but in some people, for reasons we don't fully understand, have to do with genetic background and other reasons, and many reasons I can discuss. This poses the risk of autoimmune disease. So we saw, and these principles appear to unite diseases that are very different and organs that are very different using very simple models. Of course, I ignored, as you know, many other features, but I think some of them you can add back in to modulate, the position of the fixed points, etc. So I had a great time in the past few years learning about diabetes, about hormone systems, and now, like, I can tell you, I'm like an endocrinologist. So when a family member said, I'm getting thin and shivering and my heart is beating, I said, you have hyperthyroidism, and he did, and I could, so I can understand, and we have a lot of work on how hormone systems are related to mental illness, bipolar disorder, depression, and we have ideas on feedback controllers to treat them, and it's very, very exciting piece of math and medicine. So Dan says, can you knock out T cells and show mice get low blood glucose due to these slightly oversensitive mutants? So Dan is suggesting a very good experiment. So you take mice without T cells. So we're actually doing those experiments. I can't tell you, but I want to say that mice are a very tiny, a very few. They have 1,000 times less beta cells. So they have 1,000 times less mutants. So to see this effect, you need to make mice where you introduce a small number into the mice of mutant beta cells, let's say labeled with GFP, and they should vanish in the wild type, like I showed you, but not vanish in the mice without T cells. And that is the killer experiment I'd like to do, but it's hard. Dan, if you got it or not, just do your thing. Isaac, what is the driving effect of selection for these mutant cells? So I'm not sure I understand. So could you focus the question of, say, give me more context? I mean, these mutant cells happen spontaneously. So every time a cell divides, there's 10 to the minus 9 chance that any base pair would be mutated. Since you have 10 to the 9 beta cells, there's one example of every possible point mutation. Since there are about 100 point mutations that will give you at least oversensing, you're promised to have about 100 hypersensing mutants as you're born, and then cells keep dividing. So it's a somatic mutation. seems you have to exercise exponentially more as you age, since age has a more dramatic effect. Guru, that's so true. And as a 51-year-old, I'm exercising exponentially more. And I want to recommend to everyone to exercise, because it not only reduces insulin resistance, reduces your fat that causes insulin resistance and a lot of problems. It also helps your HPA axis, your stress pathway, and you have less stress. So exercise is like, not a day where you don't exercise is like a day you take a depressant pill. And I don't know, if I exercise exponentially, I'll be running marathons by the time I'm 60, so that's exciting. And do you exercise, Gurul? I don't know if you're much younger.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah,
I do. I run a lot. Yes.
yeah, I swim. Yeah, so great. So I think we had a lot of questions. I'm very grateful, and there's still some time if you have a question. I hope I answered most of them. I'm scrolling back. If you didn't ask a question, please do. It makes me feel more connected. I'm sure other people have the same question. I guess we can say that it's a good place to stop. Natanela says thanks, so thank you very much for allowing me to talk with you and to get my mind off and distract me from a lot of problems. Thank you, very informative. Thanks, great talk, Eric. Thank you very much, Jiawei. Gurul says awesome. I love these feedback. Awesome talk and awesome songs, Daniela. Very engaging. Awesome talk. Thanks very much. I feel bathed in thank yous. It's fantastic. This is better, by the way. Zoom talks are better because you can get so much feedback. I love it. Thank you for bringing light to my week with your music. Bonnie, thank you for this. And I want to say, when I get a paper to review, I look for what is fresh and new and how to realize its full potential. Of course, I say what to improve, but I let the authors pick and choose. After all, they know their own work better than I do. Hallelujah, I'll review ya. Hallelujah, I'll review ya.
Thank you. Thank you, Uri. I feel like I should.
Do I teach scientific? Yeah, this is part of a course, right? So consider this as part of the course, scientific songwriting or whatever mode of expression you want. Thanks for the talk. Okay.